All right, now that we've gone over the basics of triggers and variables and logic in Tulip, let's get into the platform and build this simple production tracking application together. If you haven't seen the application we're going to work with, you can check that video out right now. Otherwise, here's a list of requirements that we are going to use to build this application. So 1, the application should allow the user to enter a production goal, and they should not be able to move to the next screen until they've entered a number. This just makes sure that there is a value to populate on the production tracking screen. Otherwise, you're producing something against nothing. All right, moving on. The production tractor should allow our user to add and remove units produced against the target. So we should on the right have a remove or an add button, and on the left have a remove, or however you would like to configure it. You should just have both pieces of functionality. All right, the current number of units produced should be displayed on the app in real time, as should the progress toward goal, and that should be expressed as a percent. Simple enough. We just want to be able to visualize these things. It's part of the value of having real-time information in front of us. And here are some bonuses that you can build in if you'd like, if you're following along. So the application should not allow the user to submit results until the goal has been reached. The color of the submit button should change from red to green to signal that the user has completed the application. And if the user fails to input a valid number, the application should display a message to that effect. All right, great. Let's get in and start building this. And we can start with the enter shift target step. All right, so the requirement for this step is simply that we are able to input a number that is stored and read out on the next screen, and that we're not allowed to move on until we've input a valid number. Right. So just some simple design things up front. Let's really quickly create that area for a field that we can put in. So I'm just going to take a rectangle like this. Let's color it white against the background. Great. So now we have that field. We want a button now so that we have some means of inputting that quantity. So this is just going to be our basic layout for the application. I'm not going to spend as much time being super precise about the cosmetic details because those are the things you can iron out in pretty easily another time, and just me showing you how this works is more valuable than me spending a lot of time moving rectangles around. So great. We're just going to add a title to this button then, call it submit, and we will change the color to green. You can have it be whatever you want. I think green is a nice color for a submit button, but that detail's up to you. All right, so now let's get into the actual functionality of this thing. So we want to put an input in. There needs to be a space for someone to input a quantity. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to come up to the input widgets up here and select a number. And that will give us this little field right here. See, it's quite hard to see against the white background right now. So one thing we can do is make the border width a little bigger, make it even bigger still, just so we can have some more weight there. It's easier to see. It's a little too heavy, but like, again, no need to just waste our time messing around until we find the perfect weight. We'll add text there so we can label it. So we'll call this goal. Resize this a little bit, just drag it into place. Great. So this is our basic layout that we need. We have a place for a user to enter a goal, a label, and a button for them to submit it. So the next thing we're going to want to do is turn this into a variable. Resize this a little bit to make it easier to click around. So we have this field, but we need some way of storing that information so we can reference it in other areas. So we're just going to make this a variable. And when you've clicked on an input widget, the easiest way to do that is just to come over to the widget pane on the right end of the screen and create a variable in here. So it's going to give you this option to pick or create a variable. We'll just title this right now. So we'll title this shift goal. And then it'll give us the option to create a variable. Just a note on naming conventions. I don't have too much advice on how you should name your variables at this point, but you should have some sort of convention that you follow when you name your variables. This will make it much easier for you to keep track of what your variables are doing and where they are as they start to multiply in more complex applications. All right, so now we're going to have to define some information about this variable. We'll make this an integer so people can't enter like a quantity like 1.2 parts produced, and we'll set the default value to blank. And at this point, we're ready to create this variable, shift goal. Great, that exists now. All right, and now we need to define the logic for the submit button. So we remember from the requirements that one of the items that we needed to account for in this application is that the user is not allowed to go to the next screen until they've entered a quantity. Otherwise, it should display a message. So let's write that logic real quick. Because we've selected the submit button, we can just come over to the widget pane again, click the plus sign next to the triggers, and now let's define that logic. So when the button is pressed, first we're just going to want to make sure that there is a value there. So if the variable, just because we're going to check that variable that we just defined, shift goal is not blank, then move on to the next thing. Go to step, production tracker. Move myself out of the way one more time. And now let's add the else clause. So if it is blank, so else, if, add a new condition, if it variable shift goal is blank, this logic should be able to account for it. Like if, because this is going to be all other circumstances, if it's not blank, it should automatically do this. This is kind of redundant logic, but it's okay just for the sake of building this together to have that there. So then we will display a message. So show message. We'll want to write our own message, so we're going to do that as an expression. Please enter a valid number. All right, so now we need to scroll down here and save this. If you don't save it, then it's going to disappear and you're going to end up writing the same expression like 5 times. So always remember to save it and check this right here. All right, so now it's pretty easy for us to check whether or not this is doing what we want. So let's just restart the application and it should bring us to this screen. We'll have the option of inputting a goal. We can hit submit. All right, there we go. We're getting this message. Please enter a valid number. So that logic is working as it's supposed to. The next test is if it accepts our valid number. It has accepted our valid number, so we're ready to move on to the next screen. All right, so really quick, let's build the layout for this screen. So if you recall from our tour of the application, what we're going to want on this screen is a remove button, an add button, an input field for inputting units produced, and then display fields for the progress toward the goal, and the percentage. So let's just put that in real quick. So let's start with the buttons. Real quick, just do text. So remove, make this red, let it a little softer red. Copy it over. Copy and paste is your best friend as you're starting to do applications that require a lot of different interaction items on them. Right. Throw the input in real quick. Again, we'll make it a number. Can keep that field small. We'll throw a little bit of text in there so we can have a label on that input field. Just make it quantity right there. Click. Pull that down again. And we can resize these buttons just to make sure everything looks good. All right, just move that over a little. Again, I don't want to spend too much time adjusting this. And now we're going to make our 3 little underlays or overlays that we can put our production totals on, the information. So you go to assets, just create a rectangle right here. Looks about right. We'll make the fill color white to contrast with the off-white background. Right. So it looks about right. I think maybe instead of spacing this, the easiest way to do this right now would just be to change the border color to some kind of dark gray or black and change the border width to maybe 2 right now, just so that we have some delineation between the different panes. And that should look great. We have these screens, all of these together. We'll just move them over slightly to the left to align them. Okay, good. Now let's add some text to that. Actually, let's move this all down a little bit so we can have room for that analytic that we'll build later on. Great. And just so we have a placeholder, we can just put that analysis in by embedding it up at the top. See, I use the embed right here. We have all sorts of options to embed. Just going to put an analysis in for now. So click off that. Great. So now let's add some text to our fields. We can do that just by adding text. Output for our first one. Make it a little bit smaller. copy that over, just rename it goal, copy it once more, and call that progress. Great. So this is our rudimentary layout for this application. So let's get in and start adding logic. And let's start in the same place that we did in the last screen on the last step and add a variable to this quantity right here. So we're going to do the same thing. So we'll go over, create a variable, we'll call it input quantity. Create that really quick. Again, we'll make it an integer so people can only put in whole numbers. We do not add a default value. We will create that really quickly. All right, so now we need to display our variables. So really quickly, we will start by putting in a variable. So this is now we're going to add the ability to actually populate and visualize what's happening in our output variables at a given time. So right here, we'll make this a variable called, let's call it actual output. This is the variable that we're going to increment. So we'll make another one. Get a number or integer, either one. No default value. And we will create that real quick. So make that text larger. Great. And then for goal, we already have a variable for goal. So we'll go up here, embed a variable again. Simply should be shift goal. All right. And you can see right here that you already have that. We can resize it just a little bit. You can play around on your own to resize it to the most appropriate size for your application. Okay, so now we're at the point where we're adding logic to this application. Great, so what we're going to want to do is we're going to take the quantity that's in here and we're going to increment this variable right here. So let's go in and do that. All right, so one button is pressed. First, let's just make sure that the variable input quantity isn't empty so that we're actually adding something. If the variable input quantity is not blank, then we're going to increment. So the way to do that is data manipulation, increment. So we've picked the operation. Now let's pick what we're going to increment. So we're going to increment the variable actual output. And now we need to pick what we want to increment it by. We want to increment it by input quantity. So here we are incrementing the variable actual output by the input quantity. All right, and now, okay, I just did a faux pas. You want to name your trigger. So we can name that trigger real quick, add units. Otherwise, you'll wind up with an application that has 40 unnamed triggers and no idea what they do. This is just a simple habit to get into right up front. So let's test to see if this is working. There you go. Okay, we haven't added any logic to the other one, so it's incrementing at this point. I feel like it's a little obnoxious that they're not aligned, but you know, that's fine. We'll work on that later. There's no. All right, so let's add the logic to decrement it. And to me, the easiest way to do that is to simply copy and paste this trigger. So we can click on here, add a trigger, paste, or paste here. Great. So we've pasted this trigger. We'll call it subtract units. I just used copy C, copy V. You can use the buttons up in the top right, or Command C, Command V, just your simple keyboard shortcuts for adding and subtracting, or copy and pasting things. Subtract units. And here we'll just change it to decrement, because what we really want to do is subtract things away. Now you can see on this button we have subtract units. So that's a useful shortcut to know that you can copy and paste triggers across. So I had this removed too, here. And at this point we should be able to remove things. So great, we're removing things, we're adding things, it's working. Cool. So now we need to do the next step, which is to um, update the progress based on, or update the percentage based on the progress. So let's add another variable to do that. Okay, so we'll come over, let's create a variable. We'll call it progress as percent. We will make it a number. We'll add. Close this. Now let's embed it really quickly. So actually, let's keep that copy and paste momentum alive and just copy and paste that one because it's already formatted and make it progress as percent. Great. So now we just need to update the triggers to make this to calculate the percentage as well. We can do this in the exact same trigger. We could also make this a separate trigger if we wanted to, but we're just going to add this a new action. I say this right now because it's often a good practice to separate out different actions into separate triggers rather than loading them into one trigger. It makes things easier to troubleshoot, and it often is cleaner to read in the long run, where if you have a very complex piece of logic, you might end up with 10, 15, 20 rows of conditions and actions within a trigger. So break up your triggers when you can. But for now, we'll just add a new action, which is, so we're going to store as a percent. So the way we're going to do that, we're going to go to data manipulation, store, and we're going to calculate that by percentage by using expression. So parentheses, app info, or rather variable. We need to find that variable. So actual output divided by variable. You need to remember what you've named these things. Shift goal times 100 and save into a variable progress as percent. Save, and we will look over and see how this works. Oops. Okay, so I haven't added the logic to the decrement yet, but you can see that this is updating. We can also just add a little percentage sign here so this looks a little cleaner. Right now it looks kind of sketchy just with the, make it the same size. There we go. Throw that right there. And not beautiful, but functional, which again, often is what you need. Though you should have higher standards than that. Beautiful and functional. Great, and so now we'll add the same logic to subtract units. Just add new action, go through data manipulation, store, expression. So when you use the @ sign, this will allow you to call up all of these different pre-populated fields. So variable, I'm just going to type in actual output divided by variable shift goal times 100, save to location, progress at percent. Save it, and great, now it's updating as we do this. Same should be true if we change the input quantity. Great. All right, so before we conclude this video, let's actually add 2 more items from our list of requirements. Let's add the piece of logic that will prevent us from completing the application until our actual output is equivalent to our shift goal, so until we've met that goal. And then let's add a piece of logic that will change the color of the complete button to notify us that we're allowed to complete it. All right, so first, let's change the logic on the complete button. So first, we're going to click into the trigger on the complete button right here. That will allow us to edit the logic surrounding the completion of the application. All right, so the condition we want to add here is pretty simple. We just want to make sure the value that's in the variable actual output is greater than or equal to the value that's in the variable shift goal. So the way to add that logic is to do precisely what I just said. So we're going to go and specify that the variable actual output is greater than or equal to the variable, variable shift goal. And if that's the case, it's going to allow us to complete the app. So we're also going to want to add an action or a condition that, or an action that allows us to do something else if that condition isn't met. So let's add a new if-then clause. So it's just going to be an else here. So in all other instances, in this case, it's just going to be simply that it's less than our shift goal. We will say add a new action, and let's just have it display a message that says outstanding units. We'll save that expression. All right, so now we can quickly test to see if this is working. So we can add just one, so we'll get on our way. Outstanding units, not going to let us complete. Great. Okay, so now let's add the color to notify us that when we can't complete. If you want to see that this does work, we just go up and click complete. It allowed us to do it. Great. Let's move back into here. All right, so the way we're going to deal with this color is we're actually going to create a color variable on this complete button, and then create a piece of logic in the add button that updates the color of that variable based on certain conditions. All right, so let's do that. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to click on button color, make sure we have the complete button selected. And if you can look over at the top, you have variables right here. Okay, so we can select a variable. We're going to need to create one because we don't have one already. Complete. So we click on create can complete. We'll set the default value later. So it's a color, but we'll create can complete. All right, so now you see change the color because it's the default value there. So then we'll go up and edit our variables, color can complete, and we'll make that our same red color. See it updated right there, and it should have updated the app builder as well. We can try restarting the app. Oops, sorry, my internet is a little slow right now. So things might be moving a little slowly. Great, okay, so the button has updated the color. Now let's add that piece of logic. So instead of adding this to our add units trigger, let's put it in a separate trigger. This will allow us to actually troubleshoot things in separate ways without needing to just pile logic on and on to a single trigger. And it's really a best practice to break up your triggers into different units. Great, so we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to first add a condition that if the variable is greater than or equal to, or if the variable actual output is greater than or equal to our shift goal, because that's what we want to test. Actual output is greater than or equal to variable shift goal, then we need to update the color of that variable. So as with many things in Tulip, we update values by using data manipulations. So data manipulation, store, and what we want to store is a color, and you can find color under static value. All right, so color, and then now we just need to pick the color we want. Make it this nice shade of submit green. I'm going to officially coin that. Give it to Benjamin Moore, call it can complete. Save, and that should, let's title this trigger. Always title your triggers, otherwise you'll wind up with 20 triggers and have no idea what any of them do. So change color, just a simple title, should always relay back to the thing that the trigger does. And let's test it out. Moment of truth. There we go, and it updated the color. Great, so you can see that in this half hour we've built a production tracking application. We've built a screen that allows us to enter a shift goal, and then it allows us to update variables in the application to keep track of production. In the rest of the course, we're going to go much further with this idea, and we're going to start using tables and analytics and build something that's going to be really useful to you in your production, or the idea will be useful to you even if you want to build something that isn't this. All right, so we've covered variables and triggers and some fun stuff around colors. And now I encourage you to start to try this stuff out on your own ideas. And I will see you in the rest of the course.